The rise of a leader. The streets of New York buzzed with the noise of corruption, power plays, and public discontent in the late 1800s. Theodore Roosevelt, barely 30, was far from the image of a traditional politician. With his sharp eyes, unyielding determination, and relentless spirit, he was an outsider in a city drenched in political machines. Yet, it was this very environment that beckoned him, a man not content to sit idle, nor willing to compromise his ideals for comfort. Theodore's introduction to public service began with a police commissioner role, a position that appeared humble but came with its own set of challenges. New York's police force was infamous for graft, bribery, and violence, but Roosevelt, with his characteristic intensity, was ready to fight back. He wasn't just another politician playing the game. He was determined to clean up the streets, to transform a broken system. Armed with little more than his fierce sense of right and wrong, Roosevelt took on the corrupt officials who controlled the city's underbelly. He reshaped the police force, enforcing accountability, demanding reforms, and transforming it into a symbol of integrity, even as he made enemies in high places. It was this early battle for justice that hinted at the kind of leader Roosevelt would become, undaunted, willing to face adversity head-on. But his true test came when he was elected governor of New York in 1898. Roosevelt, though already an established figure due to his policing reforms and previous work, was viewed with suspicion by the old political guard. They underestimated him, thinking his rough-and-tumble, self-made persona was just a passing phase. But Theodore had a larger vision. He wanted to dismantle the machines of power that dominated New York, replace them with a government driven by the people's needs. His tenure as governor wasn't easy. The entrenched political powers of New York fought him at every turn. But Roosevelt was undeterred. He tackled issues head-on, working to regulate railroads, push through labor reforms, and ensure that the state's resources were managed responsibly. His policies and fiery speeches electrified the public, but the old guard fought to silence him. Roosevelt was too much of a force to be contained, though, and the people who had once been cynical about his maverick attitude began to rally behind him. His brand of reform wasn't just about policy, it was about revolutionizing the very idea of leadership, bringing a new vision to government, one that was bold, decisive, and uncompromising in the face of entrenched interests. But the true test of Roosevelt's political future came unexpectedly. In 1900, he was thrust into national prominence when President William McKinley chose him as his vice-presidential running mate. For many, this was a political maneuver, a way to sideline Roosevelt, making him a less prominent figure. But Roosevelt's energy, his drive, and his unyielding sense of purpose meant that he would never remain sidelined for long. It was the beginning of Roosevelt's rise, not just in New York, but across the nation. Though the vice presidency seemed a lesser role, it was a stepping stone to something greater. The nation had already seen glimpses of his leadership. Now, it would be forced to reckon with the unstoppable force that was Theodore Roosevelt. The progressive reforms. Theodore Roosevelt had ascended to the presidency in 1901, but the real test of his leadership would lie in the policies he would champion and the changes he could enact. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was at a crossroads. The nation was growing rapidly, both in size and influence, but its industrial giants were crushing smaller businesses and exploiting workers. Roosevelt, with his unwavering belief in fairness, stood ready to dismantle the power structures that had long held the nation captive. The first battle he fought was against the powerful monopolies that controlled key industries, from oil to railroads. Roosevelt's reputation as a trustbuster was born from his dogged pursuit of corporate greed. He believed that the American people deserved a fair chance, not a world where a few wealthy magnates controlled the economy. With a fierce resolve, he targeted companies like Standard Oil, which had become a symbol of monopolistic power. Under Roosevelt's leadership, the government filed antitrust lawsuits with vigor, breaking up companies that he deemed harmful to the public. The act was as much about principle as it was about policy. Roosevelt's belief in competition, fairness, and opportunity drove him to act with unshakable determination. To many, this was revolutionary. The idea that the government could challenge corporate power on such a scale was unprecedented, and Roosevelt became a hero to the working class while earning the disdain of the corporate elite. But Roosevelt's vision extended beyond economic fairness. He saw the nation's natural resources being plundered in the name of profit, and he knew that the country's future depended on conservation. He was a man who had once wandered the rugged terrain of the American West, finding solace in nature's untouched beauty. Now, he would take up the mantle of its protector. Roosevelt created the foundation for modern conservation, establishing national parks, forests, and monuments. Under his leadership, the government preserved over 230 million acres of public land, ensuring that the natural wonders of America would endure for generations to come. The conservation movement was not just about protecting landscapes, it was about safeguarding the country's identity, ensuring that its people could enjoy the wilderness as Roosevelt had, unspoiled and free. In the midst of these ambitious reforms, Roosevelt also tackled the nation's social ills. He viewed labor rights as an extension of his fight for fairness and justice. His administration enacted groundbreaking measures to improve the conditions of workers, limiting child labor, securing safer working conditions, and advocating for fair wages. Roosevelt's progressive agenda was not just about reforming the economy but reimagining what America could become. His policies reflected a deep empathy for those who had long been ignored by the elite and a bold willingness to confront the country's most entrenched problems. Yet, as with all great leaders, Roosevelt's reforms were not without opposition. The establishment, wary of the changes he championed, fought back at every turn. But Roosevelt was undeterred. He understood that the true measure of leadership was not in popularity but in progress. By the time his second term began, Roosevelt had solidified his place in history, not as a politician of convenience, but as a president who had dared to change the very fabric of America. The battle for progress was far from over, but Theodore Roosevelt had already proven one thing: he would not back down. The Rough Rider and the Spanish-American War. In the late 1890s, Theodore Roosevelt found himself at a crossroads. His political career was on the rise, but the fire inside him demanded more than boardrooms and legislative battles. Roosevelt was a man of action, and when the call for war came, he answered it not from a desk, but from the front lines. The Spanish-American War was his stage, his moment to prove that his courage was as grand as his ambition. At the time, Roosevelt was serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a post that kept him close to the machinations of military strategy and naval affairs. But it wasn't enough. Roosevelt's fervor for action couldn't be confined by bureaucracy. When war with Spain seemed imminent, Roosevelt resigned his post, eager to take a more direct role in the fight. He didn't wait for orders, he forged his own path. With the help of friends, including Colonel Leonard Wood, Roosevelt formed the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry unit composed of cowboys, Native Americans, Ivy League athletes, and assorted adventurers. This eclectic group, united by Roosevelt's unyielding leadership, would become an iconic part of American military history. The Rough Riders set sail for Cuba in 1898, facing both the perils of war and the uncertainty of their place in it. Roosevelt's charisma and personal bravery were the glue that held the unit together. They were under-equipped, but Roosevelt's infectious energy kept their spirits high. The soldiers trusted him, not just as their commander, but as a fellow warrior, one who shared their hardships and risks. The pivotal moment came during the Battle of San Juan Hill, a critical conflict in the Cuban theater. Roosevelt, ever fearless, led his men up the hill under a barrage of enemy fire. His bravery, charging ahead with rifle in hand, became the stuff of legend. Though outnumbered and facing fierce opposition, the Rough Riders captured the hill, marking a decisive victory for American forces. Roosevelt's leadership on the battlefield made him a national hero overnight. The victory was not only military, it was personal. Roosevelt's courage and leadership in the heat of battle confirmed to the American public that he was more than just a politician. He was a man of action, willing to risk everything for his country. The media, eager for a hero to rally behind, painted Roosevelt as the embodiment of American valor. He became the symbol of the new, dynamic American leader, one who rejected the comforts of the political establishment to embrace the rough and unpredictable challenges of war. As the war came to an end, Roosevelt's reputation soared. He returned to the United States to a hero's welcome, his name etched in the public's mind as a courageous and patriotic leader. It was clear now that his future in politics was limitless. Roosevelt was no longer a figure merely concerned with policy and reform. He had earned his place among the nation's greatest leaders, not through words alone, but through the blood and sweat of battle. But his rise was far from over. The Rough Riders had forged a legacy, but Roosevelt was destined for an even greater challenge, the presidency. And it was only a matter of time before that challenge would arrive. Legacy and impact. By the time Theodore Roosevelt left the White House in 1909, his impact on the United States and the world was undeniable. His presidency had rewritten the script for what American leadership could look like. But even as he moved on from the highest office, Roosevelt's drive for progress and reform remained a defining characteristic of his legacy. He was a man who understood the power of action, and his life continued to unfold like the story of an unrelenting pursuit of greatness. Roosevelt's reforms had left a permanent mark on American society. His trust-busting campaign had reshaped the nation's economy, ensuring that corporate greed no longer ran unchecked. He had created the foundation for a progressive America, one in which the government played an active role in ensuring fairness for all its citizens. The public lands he had fought to protect were not only preserved, they had become a part of America's identity. Roosevelt's legacy as a conservationist is immortalized in the national parks, forests, and monuments that bear his name. But Roosevelt's contributions extended beyond policy. He reshaped the very concept of leadership. His presidency embodied a boldness, a willingness to take risks, and a deep commitment to action that was almost unmatched in American history. Roosevelt was not a leader who stood behind a desk and issued orders. He was a man who got his hands dirty, who stepped into the field and led by example. This was the core of his appeal. Roosevelt was a man who would not ask his countrymen to do anything he was not willing to do himself. However,